Thank you all for joining us today. We have a very wide range of companies on the webinar from many parts of the world, which I think probably reflects the huge interest there is in keeping up to date with the latest developments in corporate action on climate change, on global policy, and on how we really start to deliver on the transformation of our economy that's required. I'm Rebecca Fay, and I'm the Chief Marketing Officer at Natural Capital Partners, and I'm here to moderate our webinar. I'm very pleased to welcome our two presenters today, our very own Jonathan Shopley, who leads all our work on policy and external affairs, and Dirk Forrister, who is CEO of the International Emissions Trading Association, otherwise known as IETA. I'm not going to give long introductions, but suffice to say that Jonathan is a veteran of COP and has spent many years putting the technical complexities of global climate change policy into language that is relevant for business. And Dirk, who has a long history of working with US policymakers on climate and energy, leads IETA as it continues to demonstrate the potential and power of markets and emissions trading in meeting our global climate change goals. Before I hand over to Jonathan to start us off, I just have a couple of housekeeping points. The presentations from Jonathan and Dirk today will last about 35 minutes. There'll be plenty of time for Q&A at the end. You will all be on mute, so please post any questions in the box on the right-hand side of your screen, and we'll make sure we go through those at the end. Before we hand over to Jonathan, we have our first poll. So we'd like all of you to respond to this with your thoughts on to what extent is your business or organization's climate strategy influenced by policy decisions versus non-policy factors, by which we mean non-policy factors, some sort of business strategic factors, whether it's about employee engagement or reputation or supply chain resilience or other factors that might be impacting your business. So if you could all start to make your selections on how your climate strategy is influenced based on these four options here. We'll just give it a minute and then have a quick look at those results before we hand over to Jonathan. So there you can see, interestingly, that it's sort of equal, but policy seems to be less in importance, by quite some way less important. Lots of people are saying it's equal between the two. Non-policy factors are more being more important. So that's interesting. I don't know. I won't ask Jonathan or Dirk to comment right now, but if they want to comment in their presentations, then we'll leave them to do that. But with that, I'm pleased to hand over to you, Jonathan.
Thank you, Rebecca, and my welcome to everybody online today. I've been doing these annual policy updates for quite a while now, and as the yearly climate summits come around, it always gets me wondering how it is that smartphones have revolutionized the world completely during the last 2 decades. And yet, since the first IPCC report in 1990, we haven't really got a grip on stabilizing climate change. As Extinction Rebellion points out, global emissions are still on the rise, and efforts to control them really fall far short of scientific advice. So I put this conundrum to my friend Duncan McFarlane. He and I periodically take long cycle rides across the more beautiful parts of southern England with plenty of time and the odd pub stops to chat about our respective fields. He's a professor of industrial information engineering at Cambridge. He does many things to improve manufacturing efficiencies across businesses. The one that impresses me is AI, artificial intelligence on a shoestring for SMEs, which uses personal smartphones to bring dynamic control to industrial processes. So he asked me to explain the climate policy process and actors, and then, having mulled that over, referred me to Arthur Koestler's Ghost in the Machine, first published in 1967. which delved into how complicated systems best manage devilish complexity. Kustler sets out his store with an example which is quite relevant to how we've set about developing global policy on climate change. Think, if you would, two watchmakers, Swiss perhaps, making quite similar timepieces made up of 1,000 components each. The first sets all the pieces out on a table and follows a logical process of building the jigsaw. Any disruption, change in design, interruption of supply, etc., triggers a restart of the entire process because of the nature of that particular approach. The second watchmaker sets up sub-assemblies of 10 parts and then subsystems of 10 sub-assemblies, and of course 10 sub-assemblies make up the completed watch. If we assume that there's a disturbance randomly once every 100 assembling operations, then calculations show that the first watchmaker will take about 4,000 times longer to complete a watch than the second. Clearly, there are huge benefits to having semi-autonomous units partly as wholes or wholly as parts to cut through this complexity. Kustler gave these a name, holons, and my part of this presentation examines how well we are doing in applying this holon approach to climate policy and how corporates can become more powerful holons within the complex hierarchy of players. With cooperation so critical to the operation of a holon-based system, remembering that you're master to some and servant to others, Dirk's presentation delves into the powerful and positive impact that the Paris Agreement will have if negotiations in Santiago in December go well. So with that, to my first slide. When we talk about policy, it's always useful just to do a quick summary of where we are. Of course, we've grown up in the Kyoto Protocol, and we're moving to the Paris Agreement, which comes into force on the 1st of January 2021. Now, Kyoto was very much a command and control system, and some countries had targets and some did not. And if some countries with targets bailed out, as a couple did, and others with targets grow very rapidly, as some have done, you get a very dynamic system that changes all the time and has no real holons in it that help bring the whole system into balance. So what you're looking at here is the UNFCCC, which of course is the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, to which all countries reported with simple communications on how they were doing against targets or their non-targets, and then they would make all the decisions and computations. Next slide. Now, under Paris, we've got a very different system, and you've probably heard it's bottom-up. Every country now has a target or a self-reported target, NDC or nationally determined contributions. And what you see is that sort of dynamic system that my mate Duncan talked about. You know, every country acts as a holon. They are servants to the UNFCCC. They can collaborate with each other around their targets. But more on that a little bit later. So it's a system built much more on cooperation, communication, execution, and status updates. And obviously what the UNFCCC will do under the Paris Agreement is have countries report their progress and communicate back how well that aligns to the scientifically informed targets that we need to reach if we're going to stabilize climate. There's no command and control, it's all about cooperation. And for the most part, a lot of it is voluntary in the sense that countries set their own NDCs and will ratchet them up in collaboration and cooperation with others. Next slide, please. So one of my tasks, of course, is just to see where we are in the process with the Paris Agreement, which takes on a more sort of holon-based approach with countries acting as the key components there. Now, the Paris Agreement needs a rule book to translate the agreement into operation from the 1st of January 2021. You might recall that a large part of that rule book was written or agreed in Katowice last year at the 2018 summit. But one critical piece in particular, Article 6, which talks about how the country holons will collaborate with each other, is as yet unwritten. Now, the UN, IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, civil society is piling on the pressure to get this done so we can operationalize Paris when it's due. We did have the UN Secretary General's Climate Summit in September last month, which made mixed progress in building collaboration for greater ambition and speed. Among some countries, and certainly some corporates showed real leadership, but not all. But nevertheless, work is underway to develop that rule book at the UNFCCC level. And particularly around Article 6, which aims to replace the collaborative efforts that existed under the Kyoto Protocol, particularly the Clean Development Mechanism and joint implementation, with Article 6's new provisions that will work in a bottom-up rather than a top-down world. There's been some intersessional work since Katowice last year in Bonn in the spring, and they prepared a single negotiating document which actually grew in length rather than got shorter. And Dirk will be reporting to us actually from Costa Rica, where there is a pre-COP meeting underway, which will further refine the negotiating text for Santiago. Next slide, please. So interesting distribution of the voting that we got at the meeting, to what extent those of you online are driven by policy or other aspects. And I guess what this slide sets out is the fact that action amongst corporates that are responding positively to climate change, driven by a widening set of environmental, social, and economic priorities as much as by policy and regulation. So I'm sort of pleased that the results or the votes sort of support that view. But just a quick run through what those are. UNFCCC is, rallying cry is increased ambition to get those NDCs aligned with a scientifically informed target for 1.5 degree, limiting global warming to 1.5 degrees. The UN Global Compact, another UN agency responsible for the Sustainable Development Goals, is really keen to make the connection between development and those development goals and a stable climate. The IPCC's 1.5 degree report, special report, and land use reports. Greta Thunberg and the Extinction Rebellion are really beating the drum on urgency. We Mean Business, which is a coalition of businesses that are committed to taking action on climate, are promoting carbon pricing as a mechanism to get all parts of the world sort of feeling the pressures of these environmental externalities. And then environmental NGOs and some in coalitions like the Science Based Targets and the Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosures, driving a focus on business model transformation. It's not about reducing emissions, it's about transforming ourselves for a low-carbon world. And the development and environmental justice communities are calling for a just transition. Let's make sure that we don't solve climate change at the expense of people's jobs, indigenous communities' rights to access to native forests and the like. CDP and the wider civil society communities promoting transparency and accountability. Targets without some transparency and reporting are not likely to take us where we want to go. And then other coalitions like Nature for Climate, that's not natural, Nature for Climate Coalition promotes nature-based mitigation, a really key part of the solution going forward, because sequestration through natural systems is one way in which we can draw down concentrations in the atmosphere rather than slow down their emission into the atmosphere. Consumers, of course, expressing increased preference for climate responsible products and services. So I just want to spend a moment talking about the key NGOs that are challenging business to address climate priorities from a rational science-based perspective. And I've chosen the 4 that make up the Science-Based Target Initiative. I just wanted to point out that this group's reliance upon the science to give us a rational response to climate change feels appropriate and correct. But many of the issues that affect the way in which individual corporates respond to that call for transformation are very complicated, and I will pick that up in time. But CDP, the UN Global Compact, WWF, World Resources Institute are looking for evidence that corporates are understanding their climate impacts and then reducing them and transforming themselves for a low carbon economy. And then just next build, if you would. There are a range of other coalitions, Nature for Climate, which I've mentioned, the World Business Council for Sustainable Development, Environmental Defense Fund, C2S, and the Drawdown group, I'd call them rather than an NGO, Scientifically Informed Group, are really focusing a lot of their attention on drawdown, in other words, removals from the atmosphere through natural or technological means as a critical part of the solution going forward. Next slide. Now, all of that is really shifting the sort of corporate landscape from, for example, transparency and accountability and targets, very ably led by CDP, is shifting to strategy, transformation, and enterprise value. In other words, the TCFD, Task Force for Climate-Related Financial Disclosures, is saying, look, it's great that we're getting a lot more evidence about footprints and emission reductions. We really need to understand how all this adds up to a global economy that can deliver on climate stability. Next build. And then also, it's shifting sustainability from a business objective, perhaps slightly separate to core strategy, to being the context in which business strategy really makes sense for a resilient future. Now, I want to go back to the Holon example I gave, and what you'll notice from the things that I've said so far: policy, complicated, taking a long time; environmental NGOs correctly calling on businesses to do more and to be more responsive; the scientific community ratcheting up the pressure by moving from a 2-degree target to a 1.5-degree target. And the question that we find ourselves and our clients asking is, how do we, as a small component of the larger global economy, take action that is meaningful, impactful, and directionally aligned towards a stable climate? We can't control what countries do. We can't control what the UNFCCC does, but how do we take responsibility for what we do in a meaningful way? And carbon neutrality is something that we believe gives business a practical, actionable response, very strongly aligned with the global climate goals. We have the Carbon Neutral Protocol, which sort of sets out these A, B, and C activities, or ways in which leaders or businesses taking a leadership position on climate change can target net zero emissions, first through internal reductions, for example, through a science-based target, and then through a commitment to neutrality by offsetting or compensating for the unabated emissions. Shifting to 100% renewable energy, for example, on platforms like RE100, and then using those compensating mechanisms, those offsetting mechanisms, to drive sustainable development up and down critical supply chains by choosing projects that deliver against objectives beyond just climate. And in doing so, in purchasing instruments generated by these projects, these companies get a pricing signal which sort of speaks to the view that we need a carbon price for corporates to take meaningful action. Next slide, please. So the question then becomes, I've spoken a lot about transformation, and the question is that we've been asking and our clients have been asking is, do tactical responses, if we are operating as a corporate Holon in this wider community and we go for carbon neutrality, is that going to deliver transformation? And we found some answers to that in the Talanoa, the dialogues that we held last year at the invitation of the UNFCCC, invited non-parties, in other words, people outside of countries, to submit their thoughts about how to operationalize the Paris Agreement. And we did one with 7 roundtables involving 61 companies, representing 1.3 trillion in combined revenue, from San Francisco through to Amsterdam. And through those conversations, we looked at whether net zero or targeting net zero and carbon neutrality drives transformation. Next slide. And what we found through those conversations and that dialogue is that we all understood that carbon neutrality means taking responsibility for your footprint, your tail print, in other words, your scope 3 upstream, and your handprint, your scope 3 downstream. And then combining that attention, that tactical attention to reducing those to zero with 4 other key actions. Having a brain print, in other words, putting this transformation, this commitment to zero at the heart of business strategy, having a blueprint, a plan that translates that goal into partnerships, governance, technology, investments in capital assets that will deliver that. A fingerprint approach, meaning making the strategy relevant to all staff and management so everybody understands their role within the delivery of this wider this goal. And then newsprint, and that was pretty key, this advocacy of using a company's commitments, strategies, plans as an inspiration to others and a signal to others that we need to do this in collaboration. So we then, a couple of months ago, decided to sort of investigate whether some of the more transformative aspects of corporate responses were in fact going to deliver or look likely to deliver transformation. And what it shows is that our Fortune 500, the Fortune 500 Global is taking action with a rapid increase in commitments following the Paris Agreement. And what you can see is carbon neutrality has been around since the early 2000s, but after 2015, science-based targets, RE100 commitments and combinations of those and commitments to carbon neutrality sort of all have kicked off. Next slide. And here is a list of the Fortune 500 global companies that have made public commitments that they are or will be carbon neutral. And I'll let you sort of cast your eye down that list. The heavy emitters tend to be more on the right-hand side. They need more time to transform their capital asset bases and the like. And some of the more service-based companies have got shorter-term commitments. Next slide. But what was interesting for us is to see this Venn diagram where you look at those making science-based targets, carbon neutral commitments, and RE100 commitments. And what we see is that companies with commitments to carbon neutrality are 4 times more likely to have a science-based target and 6 times more likely to have an RE100 commitment, which indicates that sort of carbon neutrality acts a little bit as a linchpin for a range of initiatives that are likely to drive deeper transformation internally within those organizations. Next slide, if you would. And for me, I think outside of that research, the other very exciting development that we've seen recently is how carbon neutrality is sort of expanding from operations, corporate's own footprint, into products and services. And examples of that would be the Microsoft Xbox pilot with 800,000 plus Xbox consoles being carbon neutral. And in the UK, Betty's and Taylor's carbon neutral tea and coffee, which sort of builds out of a 10-year program of investment in mitigation projects in Africa. Next slide. And that, the excitement there is that those kind of approaches to products and service neutrality provides a more complete response to the climate impacts of corporations, particularly when we look at their trading patterns. And so this is my last slide, and it's a return back to the whole-on concept. And what you can see here is that the UNFCCC sits above countries, states, regions, cities, individuals, as a sort of a hierarchy of whole-ons. And then corporations, multinational corporations, of course, sort of cut across all of those countries. And the approaches to carbon neutrality allow corporations to take meaningful action in each and every country in which they operate, whether that's neutralizing their footprint or financing mitigation projects to deliver on carbon neutrality. And the thing that's important for us to know about that voluntary action as we go into the Paris Agreement era in 2021 is that these two don't interfere with each other. They complement each other. A corporation that is funding a mitigation project in a host country like Betty's and Taylor's in Kenya doesn't show those emission reductions to the UK government. So the corporate accounting is wholly complementary to the UN reporting. So everybody's acting as a sort of self-actuating holon, independently collaborating, directionally all focused on a major transformation of the global economy. Last, actually just my handover slide to Dirk. So critical to that, the fact that corporations lie over or overlap a range of countries which are all now developing their individual plans in DCs, it's really important that Article 6 of the Paris Agreement, which is the one about collaboration amongst countries, that country to country at the bottom here where Article 6, the red arrow is, and that, Dirk, I think is the launch pad I'm going to give to you to pick up and tell us what's happening around Article 6 and how, if things go well, we should see the real benefits of a holonic collaborative system. Thank you.
Thank you, Jonathan, very much. And yeah, interestingly, perhaps the sort of the optimism of a holonic, I don't know if that's right, structure and system, which is really requires that much collaboration, so much collaboration. So it will be fantastic to see if that sort of can progress in today's perhaps sometimes uncollaborative world. With that, thank you very much. I'm now going to hand over to you, Dirk, and yes, please do keep we've had some questions, do keep them coming in if you've got questions while Dirk is speaking. Over to you, Dirk.
Thanks, Rebecca, and thanks to Jonathan for doing such a great job in setting the stage for what I'm going to talk about, which is the value of Article 6. And this is a topic that is very central to IETA's work, obviously, at the UN, but something that we wanted to contribute to that process is some numbers around how valuable Article 6 could be to countries in achieving their climate ambitions. So let's go to the next slide. Jonathan touched on this earlier, that we're kind of in this conference season leading up to COP25. The buildup is definitely in full swing. I think over the last 6 weeks, we've had UN climate weeks held in Africa, or not Africa, but Latin America, Asia, and General Assembly, and now at the pre-COP in Costa Rica. And in all of these, there is a strong push for the 1.5 degree target to become sort of the new mantra. Paris actually talked about 2 degrees and best efforts to get to 1.5 degrees. But this concept of net zero or carbon neutrality is one that I think is starting to dominate the conversation. Is you know, here in Costa Rica, and I think building on New York, they're celebrating the number of jurisdictions that have pledged to get to net zero by 2050, which is complementary to what Jonathan showed you on the corporate front. So all of this, I think, is leading toward not just setting or making clear what the long-term target is going to be, but also trying to establish a stronger set of targets on that pathway, so that the lines are starting to decline towards net zero, and that also so that targets start to expand beyond just the initial amounts that were put in NDCs. It sort of begs the question, though, I think, about what net means, because some people just see the zero and just think about the zero. But in fact, all of the analysis that I've seen shows that we're going to need this net concept to deliver a lot. And to us, it means that there has to be the ability to cooperate across sectors, across international borders, and netting out of sources and sinks will be a big part of it, which is all about the world of Article 6. Next slide, please. And that picture is of Christiana opening the conference here in Costa Rica yesterday. Christiana Figueroa is the former exec secretary, and she made these very points. The vision that I think we at IETA have is that the NDCs need to start getting broader in their coverage, and they need to start declining to net zero. And as an organization, I think for IETA, it sort of puts us in a particular place in the firmament of business groups, in that we sort of support caps on emissions and support declining to net zero as long as we can make the net work. The theory is that some emissions will remain, so removals are going to be key, both from nature and from technological solutions. And when you look around the globe at where those opportunities exist, they're not spread equally. Not every country has vast amounts of those opportunities. So that's why a transfer system under Article 6 could be important in bringing large-scale reductions and removals kind of to bear so that we can actually achieve the net zero goal. So in that sense, it is an essential part of the Paris Agreement. And it's one of the, if not the main place that sort of speaks to the private sector about its ability to engage in these markets of the future. So we've been working on this concept about markets of the future for a number of years now. And I think it's kind of amazing that we've gotten to this point without much quantitative analysis about what might it be worth. And I don't know if your bosses have ever asked you, how much is this thing worth? But we wanted to explore that. So next slide. We had an opportunity to collaborate with some economic modelers at the University of Maryland who run a model that was developed by the Pacific Northwest National Lab in the US. And the lead researcher is a guy named Jay Edmonds, who is one of the IPCC lead authors. And we gathered a coalition of companies, of the CPLC at the World Bank, a set of governments, research groups, the EBRD, and we essentially funded some modeling by this expert team and then vetted it in a set of workshops and reviews by a stakeholder panel that included NGOs, Article 6 negotiators, research organizations and businesses. We also invited the Electric Power Research Institute and the Environmental Defense Fund, who are also doing modeling on this topic, to compare their results because they use different modeling tools. And interestingly, most of the time we're finding pretty similar results. The initial work focused on sort of a functioning Article 6 that's primarily deriving reductions across the fossil fuel and industrial landscape. But later added sinks. And I'm going to give you a quick summary of this work now, looking at it both through the lens of economic potential and ambition potential. So you'll see these two macro questions that we looked at around economics and ambition, and a number of the sub-questions that we explored. And there at the bottom of the slide, there's a citation, or you can find it on IETA.org website. Now let's go on to the next slide. So we're going to start with the economic potential. And essentially what the starting point is that the modelers produced this chart to the left, which is their assessment of what the existing NDCs would accomplish if countries act in isolation, so independent NDCs, an INDC. The model divides the world into 33 regions, and so you can get a sense of sort of, if you extrapolated forward the existing level of ambition, what it would achieve. So in a way, you can think of this as something like more like a 2.8 degree picture. The methodology they used is one that was developed in a science paper in 2015 for assessing the NDCs by Alan Fawcett at US EPA with a whole slew of other authors. So let's move on to the next slide. So in trying to assess what would happen if instead of having independent implementation, you allowed cooperation in achieving those targets. I think it was a pretty stunning result. First of all, look at that spaghetti diagram on the right. That is essentially what the model interprets the existing commitments to do. And you can see that the price has quite a range. It's all over the place. The thick red line is the middle. Or is the joint NDC line, which sort of shows you what it would be if the model allowed them to all converge in a common market. We recognize this is a nirvana state, right? It's probably beyond our imagination to actually achieve this much. But if you just want to know the theoretical potential, it takes you from essentially in 2030, 0 to $100 a ton down into the 38 per ton range. And then you can see those other numbers taking it out into the future. So in essence, it can cut the compliance cost in half. And I think the overall savings by 2030 is, well, we'll see it in the next slide. Let's go ahead and move to the next slide. It would be in the range of 250 billion US dollars per year in savings by 2030. And by the end of the century, obviously a lot can happen by the end of the century, but it's up in the $1 trillion range. One of the interesting things about it, though, is this is a picture of what happens to GDP changes if you allow this cooperation, if you enable this cooperation, and it benefits everyone. Obviously, some regions benefit more than others, but the interesting part is that everybody's better off. And when you think about how to like some of the economic turmoil and how that can affect real people and their real livelihoods, I think this is really an important part of the picture to understand is that these tools can be good, whether you're a buyer or a seller, you're better off at the end. Let's go ahead to the next slide. This is the ambition picture. And for this one, the modelers took the approach of assuming that each nationally determined contribution is sort of an expression of how much a country is willing to pay. And if you allowed if you thought of it in that way and thought, okay, if they're willing to pay that much and cooperation in the market brings the cost down, what would happen if they redeployed that in more climate action? And what it showed, this was a sort of a strengthening of the commitments to spend all the money, if you will. It showed that an additional 5 gigatons per year in mitigation could be enabled by 2030. And that's a pretty big number because the existing indices, I think, achieve about 10. So this could add a significant, on the order of 50% more just on the industrial side. Okay, let's move ahead. So the next question they asked was, okay, what if we allowed land-based mitigation? So we're thinking of this as natural climate solutions. What if we allowed them to join in, essentially flip the switches in the model to allow those areas of abatement to come into the picture? And again, the results, I think, pretty stunning. In essence, they add an additional 70 billion in cost reduction by 2030, but they also add an additional 4 gigatons, which roughly doubles the amount of ambition that would be possible if you sort of allowed Article 6 to operate widely and across the land use sector. Obviously, there's some real-world challenges in achieving this, but the size of the combined prize there is something on the order of 320 billion in savings in 2030, and an additional 9 gigatons of mitigation potential. Next slide, please. So this is another picture of it that gives you a little bit of a sense of who the buyers and sellers are, and then if it was just fossil fuel and industry, what that looks like, and then if you add land use and land use change and forestry, what that looks like. And again, one of the bottom line results of all of this is whether you're on the buy side or the sell side, you're better off by virtue of the savings and economic benefits of cooperation. And obviously the planet would be better off because of the additional potential for mitigation if we can find the right incentives to drive countries to take on more mitigation. Next slide. So this is kind of a summary, but I think of it as kind of making the key point, which is really about how much potential there is. Everyone's better off. But most importantly, there on the right-hand side, that additional mitigation, this kind of gives you the picture of how much more can be done compared to where I guess you'd look at the conditional NDC case and say that's the best case scenario of the existing commitments and what they could achieve. So this level of cooperation could double the amount of mitigation that is made available. One of the key questions, though, is that I want to reinforce that we're still exploring is how could you create the incentives for countries to actually see this economic reality and in their next NDC step up to take on a greater level of ambition given the economic realities. And when you think about the years leading up to the Paris Agreement, that's when most of the targets were developed. Most of the NDCs were put together before Paris. So obviously in the last 5 years, we've learned a lot. And if you knew that Article 6 was there and had the potential to enable you to engage in partnerships to reduce emissions jointly with others, if you absolutely could rely on that, it could inspire countries to take on more ambition. Next slide. So in thinking about how to get at these benefits, again, reinforcing its theoretical potential, and we're now exploring what are some levels of inefficiency that could be added to the model. Could we look at results that involve smaller pockets of trading communities, either by region or by target type, or you know, we're essentially thinking of this as sort of the club concept. And it also means that there's real pressure on negotiators to get the rules right this year. At COP25, I was really gratified yesterday. The Chilean president, the Chilean environment minister, who will be the COP president, spoke at an OECD event, and her prime focus of her remarks was around this very topic of Article 6 and unleashing the technology and the natural solutions that are needed to get to net zero. Environmental integrity is sort of the main watchword of what people are working on in this, and that's really around how to avoid double counting, how to make sure that the units that are being traded are being reported honestly by both a buyer and a seller so that they aren't both using the same reduction. But in their zeal for getting a good system of accounting, there are also discussions about various types of restrictions, limits, and on one end of the spectrum, and what we would think of as loopholes on the other. The biggest one being a push from some countries that if a unit is produced by the centralized mechanism, which is kind of like the new version of the CDM and JI programs of the past, sort of a project-based reduction unit at the UN. There's a group that thinks that if a unit is verified and certified by that body, that it shouldn't have to be accounted for along with other things or with their regular emissions trading systems. And I think that's an area that's causing great concern as a loophole, because it kind of puts you back in the Kyoto world where anything coming out of the CDM is off balance sheet, and you're not really accomplishing what you think you are in terms of at least the Paris architecture. I think the next step is going to be getting clarity about how countries are going to use Article 6. I expect there will be formation of various trading clubs. We've seen some linkages form already with Switzerland and the EU. We now see what a treaty looks like for a country to join the EU ETS. And similarly, the California-Quebec examples in North America. And similar sort of club concepts like that are under discussion in the Pacific Alliance in South America, or in the there's a similar grouping in Asia and another in Africa that are all exploring how they could use Article 6 for their own regional purposes. Part of this is also going to be about improving the NDCs going forward. One of the issues they're really stuck up on right now in the basic accounting is they're stuck on how to account for trades that occur over a multi-year period. If a country only has a one-year, a point-year target, and another country has a multi-year target, so this single-year, multi-year discussion. Hopefully, they get all of this sorted out for us, so that they have confidence in the systems and that they can pursue these linkages to sort of capture this potential. this final point I've touched on previously about what type of incentives can increase the ambition, which is something clubs could offer a piece of that, but I think part of it is also going to be around sort of countries coming together on what types of targets they're going to pledge in the future, what sort of NDCs in the future. And I think, next slide. I think yes, so thank you. And there's the citation again to the full report, or just go to the IETA website and you'll see it coming across a banner. Thanks a lot. And Rebecca, I'll hand it back to you.
Thank you, Dirk, very much for that. That was fantastic of a quick whip through something that I know is quite complicated and still quite a few questions about what's going to happen later on this year. We have another poll before we go on to the Q&A. So our question to you now, which we'd like you all to answer, is how much do you think markets and emissions trading, voluntary or compliance, will play a role in your organization's climate strategy? So do you feel that market and emissions trading is going to play a significant role, a small role, you prefer non-market mechanisms, or you don't know? It will give you a couple of seconds to respond to that poll. Before we go on to, we've had a couple of questions that it would be good to try and get to in the final 10 minutes. So I think we'll see that now. Interesting. So markets and emissions trading will play a significant role. I think that is by far the largest of the groups there, which is interesting considering the earlier poll results where policy was less important in company strategy. So that's an interesting sort of juxtaposition of those two responses. So thank you for that. So I'm going to just go through a few of these questions. So we've had a few questions which are all along the same line. So I'm going to paraphrase into one question for you, Jonathan and Dirk, which is how is the research from the University of Maryland is obviously very compelling in terms of emissions reductions that can be achieved and also savings that can be made. But how is it different? How is the Article 6 and the way that trading might work in Article 6 different from the way that emissions trading has worked based around the Kyoto Protocol? What is different that might make it more impactful and perhaps more successful than it has been under the Kyoto Protocol? So I'll go first of all to Dirk, if you have any thoughts on that.
Well, I think the big difference is countries, everybody has a target now. And so for a country to engage in the market mechanism, they need to have a game plan about what they're going to use in terms of emission reductions or removals, what they're going to use on their own account for meeting their share of the NDC, and how much beyond that is going to be available for transfer. And then they're going to have a system of reporting that according to this UN template. Now, I'm not sure that the template has to be that complicated. It'll be a number, a net number that occurs over a period. I think that's sort of the trend of it. But the numbers are supposed to match, an independent investigator is supposed to be able to look at this and kind of tell, well, if New Zealand bought this many and Senegal sold this many, do they match up? And that accounting system, we talk about emissions accounting in this, that's the vital piece of integrity, I think. And that's different than in the Kyoto era. We had sort of a central registry of assigned amount units that were set out from the UN itself, and you had to as a country live within your means of those AAUs, etc. So there were some similarities, but this is very different in that it's country driven, and there will have to be some kind of architecture at the UN to capture all of this information.
Thanks, Dirk. Jonathan, any thoughts from you?
Yeah, Dirk, I completely agree with your comments that, this is going to bring much more rigor around the double entry bookkeeping that's going to be required to keep integrity there. But I suppose I just sort of lean back on my Holon example. I think that we're replacing sort of central control at the UNFCCC with responsibility at each country level to develop NDCs that are measurable, reportable, and also to address, Dirk, one of the points you made, that opportunities for mitigation are not evenly spread around the globe. So allow individual countries to hold out opportunities for others to invest, whether it's private sector or other countries, in their mitigation efforts if they don't have the regulation or the resources, financial resources to do so. So I think for those reasons, we can expect a great deal more progress under the Paris Agreement.
Thank you. Thank you both very much. So on that question, I guess the follow-up question that someone has asked is, which sort of segues very nicely, is to both of you, and I'll go to you, Jonathan, first, because one is about yours and one is to Dirk. So 25% of the Fortune 500 global, that's an interesting number, pretty good number, I think, for some people, quite surprising, that have some sort of commitment. Have you, what are the barriers, or what are the opportunities, or where do you see that trajectory of getting to the other 75%? Any sort of, I know it's a big complex question, but that's what's been asked, you know, any immediate thoughts on how you get the other 75% to make their commitments?
Yeah, good question, and you're right, it is quite complicated, but you know, if you allow me the indulgence of sort of leaning back on the whole-on example, I think what we need to do is to make sure that every corporation, every business, no matter how simple or complex it is, has got actionable things that they can do that deliver business value to them and are well aligned with the global goals. So what I think we're seeing now is commitments to carbon neutrality, for example, which align very, very well with the Paris Agreement, the IPCC report, you know, many of the external environmental NGOs imperatives, is being made easier to do. We've got a clearer sense of what that looks like. It's, you know, it's abatement as fast and as far as you can take it internally, matched with, or, you know, using compensating mechanisms elsewhere that make a difference in the countries where those projects are being funded. Difference in terms of climate mitigation, adaptation, and delivery of the SDGs. So keeping that simple so that the climate leaders that I spoke a little bit about, that 25%, then inspire the smart followers to follow in their tracks and repeat at scale these simple, immediate actions that are under their direct control. I think that holds promise, particularly adding in carbon neutral products and services as an extension up and down supply chains, really holds promise of making this more mainstream than it has been in the past 20 years or so.
Thank you. And then on a very similar theme, Dirk, for you, do you see an increase in countries setting net zero targets?
Well, I was surprised that I think in New York, I can't remember the exact number, it's 60 or 70 jurisdictions have set net zero targets for 2050, and I think we will see an increase in that. I think that you can be cynical about it and say that's easy for a country to, you know, a government to do, because they're probably not going to be around in 2050 to be responsible for meeting it. But I think the pressure on further aligning, I'll just use Europe as an example. The incoming presidency wants to make clear their intention of getting to net zero by 2050. Europe had never said that before. They had talked about, you know, getting down in the 80 to 95% below range by then. But now it's a net zero proposal, still has to be approved by the parliament and by the member states. But I think what's more significant about it is the interest in strengthening the 2030 target by another 10 points. So taking it from a -40 to a -50 or 55. And I think you will hear a cry from European industry to reopen trade routes so that there is an ability to tap into natural climate solutions, so that there's an ability to tap into low-cost abatement that's outside of the EU. as sort of re-entering an era of more cooperation, particularly if they go to the 55% level. And I think there will be other countries starting to do that.
Great. Thank you very much, Dirk. I think I'm going to squeeze in one more question before we call this to the close. And again, I think it's the question's been asked, Dirk, I think it's probably more complicated than a 2-minute answer, but we'll give it a go to just give some high-level thoughts. So it was a very compelling case for how land use, natural climate solutions, how they, that can really even up the ante in terms of the potential. What do you think is required to achieve that potential of nature-based solutions?
So I'm convinced that public investment alone isn't going to do it, and that therefore we need more compliance systems, market systems that recognize those types of units for compliance. If you look across the universe of the strong market programs that are out there right now, Europe does not tap into these at all. California does. California has a significant role for forestry credits. They haven't done as much in soils, but we're hoping that they'll eventually sort of start to explore those as well. But if you go north of the US border into Canada, the province of Alberta has had significant experience in carbon farming with involving their farmers in improved tillage programs to increase soil carbon. And Australia has also demonstrated that those approaches, even though it's primarily through a government purchasing program, but that's starting to shift now toward some of the large emitters also having obligations to that. I think they would like to be able to utilize these kinds of units in a grander way. And they have some supply issues domestically, so they also would benefit from international connections. So I do think the key to it is, I know across my membership, the ability to invest when you have a rule set and a compliance driver is so much more significant than if there are questions around all of that. So, so that's something IETA will definitely be pushing more in the coming years, is integrating this into the market design. I should have also mentioned Colombia, because that's sort of the new kid on the block, where there's a tax and offset scheme that's using nature-based solutions that I think it's been sort of a real interest to their neighbors in other parts of South America.
Thank you, Dirk. Jonathan, have you got a couple of comments on that as well in our final minute?
Yes, so all I'd add to Dirk's very able and insightful comments is the fact that a lot of voluntary action that's occurred over the last, let's say, almost 20 years has driven some of the voluntary standards to develop very pioneering approaches to being able to set up and create transactable instruments from afforestation, improved forest management, forest protection projects. Now the challenge is, so that means that there's been a great deal of innovation within those corporates that have taken voluntary action and supported those kind of projects. And I think Dirk, what Dirk's been talking about is the way in which those have now been taken into compliance systems, strengthened in terms of nesting these within national plans. So it's not just project-based. We can start thinking about landscape scale projects that really scale up the opportunity. I'll leave it there.
Excellent. We're right on, or just seconds away from the hour. So with that, I think it was a real pleasure to listen to you both. Thank you both so much for your presentations. I hope everyone found it useful. We will be sending a link out of the webinar, so please feel free to share it with your colleagues and friends if you think that it would be of interest. And we'd like to thank you all very much for your time, and wish Dirk and Jonathan good luck in Santiago.
Thanks a lot.